You know, people always say that buying a house in a quiet, manicured suburb is the ultimate American dream. But let me tell you, for Sarah and me, that dream started feeling a lot more like a low-budget psychological thriller the moment we moved into Blackwood Estates. And it wasn't because of the neighbors or the mortgage rates. It was because of one woman named Martha who thought her HOA presidency gave her the divine right to play God with our lives. I'm a guy who values peace. I spent 12 years in the service and another 5 as a tactical instructor. So when I retired, all I wanted was a patch of dirt, a few chickens, and a place where my wife could paint her canvases in the sun without some busybody measuring the height of our grass with a literal ruler. But Martha, she was something else. She had this permanent sneer like she was constantly smelling something sour, and she decided from day one that our rustic vibe was a stain on her perfect little kingdom, which led to months of fines for things that didn't even exist in the bylaws, like the aggressive way our firewood was stacked, or the fact that our backyard coop was painted a shade of sage green she deemed provocative, It was exhausting, truly, but I figured if I just ignore the letters and paid the occasional petty fee, she'd eventually find a new target. But I underestimated the kind of madness that brews when a small person gets a tiny bit of power, and it all came to a head on a Tuesday afternoon that I will never, ever forget. I was pulling into the driveway after a long day at the range. The sun was hitting the windshield just right, making everything look golden and peaceful. But then I saw them, 3 massive, customized cruisers idling right at the edge of my lawn, their engines creating this low, guttural vibration that you could feel in your teeth, and my heart just dropped into my stomach. I didn't see Sarah at first, but as I killed the truck's engine, the silence that followed was even more terrifying, and that's when I spotted her. She was backed up against the cedar siding of the chicken coop, her hands raised slightly in a gesture that wasn't Oppo's. Exactly fear, because Sarah is the toughest woman I know, but it was definitely I am being hunted, 3 guys in heavy leather vests. The kind with patches that scream Don and Oppos, mess with us, we're closing. And on her, and one of them, a guy with a greasy ponytail and a grin that showed way too much gum, was leaning in her personal space, saying something that made her jaw tighten. I didn't in Oppos to even think, I just felt that old familiar click in the back of my brain, that shift from neighborly Joe to the man I used to be when things went sideways in a desert half a world away. And as my boots hit the gravel, the sound was like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. The leader, a mountain of a man they called Oppos, Big Alan Oppos. I found that out later. Turned around with this smug, lazy confidence, his thumbs hooked in his belt loops, as if he owned the air I was breathing. And he just barked This is HOA business, buddy, so why Don Oppos? Till you just go back inside and let the grown-ups finish the conversation? I looked at Sarah, her eyes met mine, and I saw that flicker of I'm okay, but get these losers off our land, And I felt this heat rising up my neck, not a blind rage, but a cold, calculated clarity that I haven't and Oppos felt in years. I told them, as calmly as I've ever said anything, You've got exactly 30 seconds to tell me why you're standing on my property and why you're crowding my wife before I decide that you're a threat that needs to be neutralized, And the greasy one actually laughed, a wheezing sound that smelled like stale cigarettes and cheap beer. He told me that, President Martha, was tired of us ignoring her authority, that we needed a, physical reminder, of the rules, and that they were just there to provide some, community encouragement, to tear down the coop and get in line. I looked at my watch, not because I was bored, but because I was timing the end of their peaceful afternoon, and I told them, You've got 3 minutes. In 3 minutes, you're going to wish you'd stayed in bed today, And the leader just sneered, mistaking my restraint for a bluff, and he made the fatal mistake of turning back towards Sarah to finish whatever intimidation tactic he had planned. He reached out a hand to grab her arm, and that was the last voluntary movement he made for a while, because before he could even blink, I had his wrist in a lock that sent him screaming toward the dirt, the sound of his pride shattering being much louder than the thud of his body hitting the ground. The other 2 froze for a split second, probably trying to process how the, quiet guy in the flannel shirt, had just folded their boss like a lawn chair while still holding a lukewarm travel mug of coffee in his left hand. But then the second one charged, swinging a wild, telegraphed haymaker that I could have seen coming from a mile away. I just slipped the punch, used his own momentum against him, and sent him face first into the very chicken coop fence they were so offended by. The hens going absolutely berserk, feathers flying everywhere like a snowstorm in July, and I swear I saw Sarah actually crack a smile as the guy groaned and slumped into the dirt. The last one, the one with the ponytail, he was the smartest of the bunch because he scrambled back toward his bike, revving the engine like the noise was going to save him. But I was already there. I grabbed the handlebars and gave him a sharp, calculated yank that sent the 500-pound machine toppling over, pinning his leg beneath the chrome and the heat of the exhaust. He let out a howl that probably woke up the neighbors 3 streets over, and I just knelt down next to him, real close so he could see that I was in oppos, even breathing hard, and I whispered in quote, "Next time Martha wants to send a message, tell her to use a stamp, because if I see any of you on this side of the street again, you want into oppos. TB limping away, you into oppos. LL be carried," end quote. By then, the first 2 were gasping for air, clutching ribs and bruised egos, literally begging me to just let them leave, stammering about how they didn't end oppos. Know it was going to be in quote, like this in quote, and that they were just told we were some in quote, soft city couple in quote, who needed a scare. I watched them scramble onto their bikes, engines coughing and sputtering as they fled like beaten dogs, and Sarah just walked over, checked her watch, and said in quote, 2 minutes and 45 seconds. You're getting slow, honey, in quote. And we just stood there, breathing in the scent of burnt rubber and victory, knowing that the war had only just begun. Word travels fast in a place like Blackwood Estates, especially when 3 in quote, tough guys in quote, are seen fleeing a cul-de-sac with their tails between their legs. And by that evening, Martha was at our door, her face a shade of purple I didn't end oppos. Know the human skin could achieve, shrieking about in quote, unprovoked assault in quote, and in quote, property damage in quote, while her pearl necklace bounced against her chest like a frantic heartbeat. She thought she had me. She really did. She was threatening police reports and lawsuits, and an immediate lien on our house. But what she didn't in oppos, realized, and what people like her always forget, is that in the modern world, someone is always watching, and my house is rigged with more high-def security cameras than a small casino. I didn't in oppos. Argue with her, I didn't in oppos. Raised my voice. I just beckoned her inside, sat her down in front of the 60-inch screen in the living room, and hit in oppos, play in oppos. On the footage from 3 p.m., watching her smug expression slowly melt into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror as she watched the entire scene unfold in crystal-clear 4K. She watched her in quote, contractors in quote, threatened Sarah. She watched them initiate the contact, and most importantly, she heard the audio from the hidden mic near the coop where the leader clearly said, end quote, "Martha sent us to break a few things and remind you who in oppos. This boss," end quote. The silence in the room after the video ended was heavy. You could almost hear the gears turning in her head as she realized she had an oppos. Just lost a neighborhood spat. She had committed multiple felonies involving conspiracy and criminal intimidation. And I just leaned back, sipped my fresh coffee, and told her that the next HOA meeting was going to be very, very interesting. I didn't end oppos. Wait for the meeting to leak the news, though. I'll let the rumor mill do the heavy lifting. And by the time Thursday night rolled around, the community center was packed, more people than I'd ever seen, all whispering and glancing at Martha, who was sitting at the head table looking like she wanted to vanish into the floorboards. I didn't in oppos. Give a speech, I didn't in oppos. Make a scene, I just walked up to the front, plugged my laptop into the projector they use for, in quote, beautification slideshows, in quote, and played the clip for the entire neighborhood to see, including the par. Where the bikers admitted they were on her payroll. The gas that went through that room was like a physical wave. People were standing up, holding their phones out to record the screen, and one of our neighbors, a retired lawyer who usually stayed out of everything, stood up and started reciting state statutes on harassment and the misuse of association funds, while Martha just sat there, frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The fallout was spectacular. It turns out that when you hire thugs to do your dirty work, they aren't and oppos. Exactly loyal when the heat comes down, and two of those bikers were the sheriff and Oppos. At office the very next morning, handing over text messages and Venmo receipts from Martha and Oppos as personal account, desperate to cut a deal to keep their own records clean. Within the week, I watched from my porch as a patrol car pulled into her driveway, and there was this strange, poetic justice in seeing the end quote. Queen of Blackwood and quote, being let out in handcuffs, still complaining about the end quote. Unbecoming and quote. Nature of the arrest while our neighbors watched from their lawns, some of them even cheering. The HOA board met that same night, voted her out unanimously, and started the long process of actually fixing the mess she'd made, implementing new rules about transparency and, not hiring bikers to assault residents. But the real kicker, the thing that still makes me chuckle when I think about it, happened a month later. I was out front fixing a loose stone on the walkway when a familiar, albeit much quieter, truck pulled up, and out stepped two of the guys from that Tuesday. Not in leather vests this time, but in plain work shirts, looking incredibly humbled and more than a little nervous. They were there as part of their court-ordered restitution, asking if there was any heavy lifting or repair work they could do around the property to make up for the, in quote, misunderstanding, and quote. I just looked at them, then at Sarah, who was painting on the porch, and I told them they could start by repainting the chicken coop, that specific shade of sage green that Martha hated so much. They worked in total silence for 3 days, polite as could be, and it made me realize that sometimes people aren't into Oppos, inherently in quote, thugs and quote, they into Oppos. Just following the lead of someone who thinks they into Oppos. Untouchable, until they meet someone who reminds them that they aren't into Oppos. We have a new HOA president now, a nice guy who actually likes chickens, and things have finally settled into that quiet, boring life we moved here for. But every now and then, I see a biker go past on a main road, and I catch myself checking my watch, wondering if I could still do it in under 3 minutes. It makes you think, doesn't it, Oppos? How many people are living under the thumb of someone like Martha just because they in Oppos, afraid to push back, or because they think the in quote, system in quote, is rigged against them? I mean, was I right to handle it the way I did? Or did I just stoop to their level of violence to prove a point? Some people in the neighborhood still want an Oppos. Look me in the eye. They think I'm in quote, dangerous in quote. Now, while others treat me like some kind of local hero who liberated the cul-de-sac from a tyrant, I don an Oppos. I just wanted to protect my wife and my home. But I'm curious what you guys think. Did I go too far by humiliating her in front of everyone? Or was that the only way to make sure a person like that never, ever tries it again? Drop a comment below and tell me if you and Oppos ever had an HOA horror story that pushed you to the brink, because I have a feeling I'm not the only one who's had to defend his castle from the very people who were supposed to protect the neighborhood.